Thank you so much to everyone who's joining us online. We're going to get started in just a moment. A quick note before we begin, if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. All of that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. Over to you, Mia.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome, I'm Mia Parrish. I'm the head of ASU Media Enterprise, and this is our latest Free Speech Project conversation. The Free Speech Project is a year-long inquiry of FutureTense, which is a project of ASU, New America, and Slate magazine that we're doing in collaboration with American University's Tech Law and Security program. FutureTense is holding a series of events throughout the year looking at how technology is affecting and challenging our traditional free speech, legal, and cultural norms. And we are publishing articles as part of the project on Slate every week. I'm joined today by Suzanne Nossel, who's the CEO, PEN America, and the author of a forthcoming book called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. It comes out in May. It looks fascinating. I'm in. PEN America has also been a great partner with us on a number of these free speech projects and events, and Suzanne spoke at our kickoff event at American University back in February. Very glad to have you. Also with us is Kyle Pope. He's the editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review. He covered media and television at the Wall Street Journal a time ago, as well as having super relevant and interesting experience running hyperlocal papers in Metro New York, and he also edited the New York Observer for a time. This is, as we have said again and again, a really vital time for free speech and free expression, not just in America, but around the world. And an informed citizenry and a vigorous press are vital to holding the powerful accountable. And this has long been a hallmark of New American democracy and is integral to our right to free speech. But as more and more communities have seen the collapsing business model come in on them and create trouble and controversy for them to be able to have their robust role in the community, we're seeing a cascading effect in traditional media business models. And COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of us having a robust free press at the same time as really causing a lot of financial issues and is creating a crisis for those ever-shrinking newsrooms across the country. I want to thank all of you for joining us as we consider the future of the news business and the possible remedies to the threat that could prove devastating to our democracy. And a reminder that we will be taking questions. You can log those at the bottom. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I thought, Kyle, maybe you could sort of set the stage for us and what's going on today and what you're seeing as an observer and a reporter, educated, knowledgeable person on this.
Yeah, unfortunately, the state of the local news business was bad before the coronavirus arrived. We're hearing a lot about pre-existing conditions and vulnerabilities, and this is an industry that was very, 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 very sick before any of this happened. And I'm sorry to say that I think it's just going to decimate the local news landscape across the country. At CJR, we do a lot of reporting on this. We compile a lot of data, and I got to tell you that pretty much a day doesn't go by in the last couple of weeks where we don't get an email from somebody saying, I'm a member of the staff of a paper, they're laying off people, they're cutting our salaries, they're discontinuing our operations. So it's very, very widespread, and I just fear that it's going to accelerate. So for us, there's sort of two projects. One is chronicling that and understanding the depths of it and how widespread it is and how many people are affected and what it means. But then we really have to start thinking about what is this business going to look like? And I don't think it's not going to reconstitute itself as it was. We're not going to see a newly vibrant commercial landscape of for-profit local newspaper. That I think is over. So the question now is what do these models look like? Who's going to fund them? What kind of help is going to be needed? We at CJR have already started running sort of op-ed pieces by people. One piece was sort of proposing a journalism stimulus program similar to the stimulus plan that Congress has passed for the overall economy. Other people are talking about, sort of a rallying cry for philanthropy, but I think for us, it's going to be the defining story sort of going forward once we emerge from this sort of terrifying healthcare crisis that we're in right now.
Right. Though it is related, you know, the terrifying healthcare crisis is causing, I liken it to it is a patient who already had all the underlying health conditions and now is infected with the virus, right?
Totally.
So it's
I mean, this was not a blow that this industry could withstand. It was already teetering, and you know, a lot of these outlets were really just trying to hold it together, and this is just going to prove to be too much.
Hold that thought, because that is central to the question of, you know, what is it that we're going to do about it as well. I thought Suzanne could weigh in on, you know, you're an expert. You've spoken internationally on free expression and free speech, and in this time where we're having certainly a lot of misinformation, but also cries for, you know, maintaining free expression in that. What do you see as the big challenges, and how's
Yeah,
that?
sure. I mean, maybe I'll just say a word about how it is that PEN America became involved in addressing this issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we are a membership organization of writers all over the country, united in defense of free expression. And after the 2016 election, we evolved from being kind of a New York-centric organization to really mobilizing our membership across the country. And we now have a network of chapters. And as we did that, press freedom concerns were uppermost in our mind. We were worried about Donald Trump's attacks on the media, his threats against journalists, and we were concerned that there wasn't really a constituency in defense of press freedom in this country that ever had to be mobilized, because, you know, we'd been able to kind of by and large take some of these freedoms for granted. They were encroached upon to some degree, but this was an unprecedented attack. But when we went across the country, you know, what we found was something quite different. And I'd say the concerns we heard overwhelmingly were much less about President Trump and his attacks and denigration of journalists, and far more about what was happening at the coalface in these local communities, where they had seen their newspapers be whether closed down, decimated, becoming what we call ghost papers, where there's almost no original local reporting, and everything in there kind of comes from somewhere else and is stitched together, in some instances being taken over by hedge funds or large corporations that were essentially milking these businesses, taking out as much cost as possible, shrinking down the reporting staff to skeleton levels, and the sense of alarm that we heard around the country about, you know, what was being lost as local news was disappearing. You know, the ability to hold officials accountable, to be informed, to, you know, foster community across different subcultures, for minority communities to have their concerns aired and heard. And so we put together a big report called Losing the News that we issued last November, kind of chronicling all of this. And we looked at 3 in-depth case studies on Detroit, Denver, and North Carolina. And we also examined, you know, what are the solutions here? Can these business models be reinvented? You know, how far can the role of philanthropy go? And we really reached the conclusion that there's a $35 billion gap in terms of lost revenue in this industry, and that to make that up or even come close, it's got to be kind of an all hands on deck approach. We do need a much more robust and up-to-date approach to public funding. And, you know, that really this represents a crisis for democracy if we allow these local news outlets to wither away. And I think the COVID crisis, you know, one silver lining is it's just made the essentiality of local news so manifest and undeniable. You know, when people need to know what stores are open, what precisely are the local regulations, you know, where can you get a test for coronavirus, like these very basic elemental needs that citizens have, amidst this pandemic, local news outlets are fulfilling. And we think of local journalists really as first responders, like they are, and they have been, journalists have been designated as essential employees just about everywhere.
Right.
So we talk about the grocery store workers and the police, but it's also the journalists who are doing this vital work, putting themselves at risk.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting how it literally is listed as an essential operation, which it is. It's essential to to our health and safety, and the knowledge and security in that. Yet we're also having a crisis of people not wanting to pay for that. I've seen so many, a lot of the operations have dropped their paywalls, and there's some controversy around whether that's a good idea or not. I don't know what Kyle's opinion is on that, but in the response to this, we're not seeing a ton of people jumping in to say, you're right, I really need to support local media. They are seeing it and needing it, but
they weren't doing that before this crisis.
Right.
It's been very hard for local media to make the case for paid subscriptions. The Wall Street Journal has been able to do it. The New York Times has been able to do it. The Atlantic has been able to do it, but very, very, very few local outlets across the country. I mean, I totally agree with what Suzanne's saying about how this highlights the critical nature of what these reporters do. And I think that's going to be even more the case once we emerge from the sort of the current immediate health crisis, because then we're going to be, then there's so much reporting to do. I mean, the amazing thing about this pandemic is it's sort of shown a spotlight on all of the problems in our society and in our life that we knew were there, but we didn't know the depths of them. So whether it's like, what is the state of readiness of our local hospital, or what has been going on in our local jail, or how equipped was the local school district to handle remote learning? I mean, these are all stories that are national stories, but they're all replicated in towns and cities all around the country. And just the desperate need to understand sort of how we ended up in this place. I mean, forget Trump and what he did. I mean, there's just a lot of local work to be done to figure out what the impact on each community has been. I think, just in terms of thinking through, I mean, this gap that Suzanne mentioned that their report surfaced, there's basically nobody that can fill that. There's no foundation big enough. There's no collection of hedge funds that are going to have enough money. I mean, ultimately, this is going to come down to us making the case that local journalism is a necessary public service, and that just like the water department and the EMS and the fire department is, and whether that, what that looks like, it could look like some kind of public-private funding. It could look like some kind of philanthropic support in the community, or it could just look like a sense of obligation for people who live in those towns to say, this is important to me, and as we've learned in the recent months, it's important to whether I live or die. I have to help pay for this. It's incumbent on me to support these places. That is the only place where we're going to be able to make up that kind of gap. If there's a public spiritedness around how important these outlets are, because there's no rescue big enough that's going to come in from the outside.
Yeah, have you seen an example of where that's worked? I mean, there are some internationally, probably what The Guardian has done, and some others where there's been more movement toward that, but the market doesn't tend to operate with public interest as a motivator.
There are examples around the world. I mean, The Guardian is interesting. I mean, it's a national newspaper, but they actually there's a lot of people who buy Guardian subscriptions and give them as gifts to other people, which I find interesting. And it sort of gets to the point that we were just making. There have been cases around the country. There was a group in New Jersey that was really looking at, is there a way that we could add a small tax that would then be used to fund local journalism? Obviously, it's very problematic because do you really want the government involved in administering this? But it was more of a thought experiment, I thought, that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
There have been other cases where just sort of local community leaders have decided, you know what, having a good local outlet is important to us, is having good parks and a good public education system and a good local theater. So we are going to like put our money where our mouth is and sort of support this, and we're going to rally other kind of prominent local people to do the same. That has happened in some communities. So we just need to be seeing a lot more of that.
And Suzanne's made the point about the ghost papers, and more than 2,200 newspapers have gone out of business in the last 5, 8, 10 years. You're going to see more and more of them. They're still continuing to be, they're going dark, or they're more like ghost papers. That's happened with TV stations as well, where you see that commoditization of news that's built out of New York showing up in Des Moines or whatever. It's not just a newspaper issue. And we're seeing that accelerate. Obviously, COVID's a variety of newspapers have gone to 2 or 3 times a week in print, or not at all. And that really exacerbates and accelerates that problem. What are you seeing, Suzanne, out there that is helpful? Or, and I'll just share one of my frustrations where you look at the comments on the stories and people are saying, why are you charging me for this? It's essential. And I'm like, you get charged for the doctor and water, and your gardener wants to be paid, and all sorts of people want to be paid. And it's an interesting conundrum to me that it's so vital it should be free, but it's so important, and it actually costs money that people don't see the value in it. So I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I think there's still sort of a hangover from the days where everything on the internet was free and people expected it to be free, and it was seen as an entitlement, and information should be unchained. I mean, we are dealing with on a separate front, the Internet Archive, which has declared for itself an emergency license to all sorts of books, just to disseminate them freely without any copyright royalties back to the author. So there is still this idea of an entitlement. And I think many local news outlets, as you touched on, have decided to drop paywalls in relation to COVID coverage as a matter of civic duty and public service. And I think that's honorable and the right thing to do, but it just doesn't answer the question of how on earth are we going to muster the resources to continue to produce this vital information. And we see reports, there's now a tracker day by day of whether it's layoffs, furloughs, pay cuts, cuts in print distribution that are being announced by local news outlets, day in and day out. I mean, this was really sort of a perfect storm in that, the business model that was destroyed and has eroded so sharply, was one that hinged on advertising, and some of the remaining sources of advertising that these even threadbare publications were still reliant on, of course, are retail stores, restaurants, event businesses, all of these outlets that have themselves been absolutely slammed by our national shutdown. And they're working on fumes right now because they don't have revenues coming in, and of course they have no need to advertise. And so it's this very difficult kind of confluence of circumstances. I'd say the one, I try to be an optimist. I think one thing that gives me some hope is that this issue is finally getting some attention. I mean, when we started out on this topic, I'd say over a year ago, I mean, Kyle was an expert, and there were experts in some of the journalism schools across the country who were looking into this and doing important data collection and reporting, but it was not a mainstream topic of conversation. And just today, I think there's an illustration of how it is breaking into wider awareness. There were 2 letters that were issued today. One was by PEN America and a consortium of other groups, including Common Cause and Free Press, about 45 different organizations writing to Congress to ask that local news be addressed in the next stimulus package. And the second, on a very similar theme, was a group of more than a dozen senators led by Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, calling for the exact same thing. And so, there is more momentum, and, we can talk about what the pitfalls of public funding are, because I think it has to be done very carefully. And, it was not our thought when we entered into an examination of this topic that PEN America would ever come out in favor of public funding for journalism, or that as part of a major part of the solution to what ails local journalism. But it was apparent to us, given the size of the gap, that it has to be part of what it has done to shore up this sector in its essential role for our democracy. So, that bit of momentum and attention, I do think is important. Obviously, we have to see it through and make sure it leads to action, and that's not going to be so easy.
Right, you're seeing a lot of challenges. Obviously, in the past, the idea of government having anything to do with, real journalism was anathema. But you're at this true crisis point where all these questions are having to be asked, and experiments are being done in Canada and other places. But we'll see.
Well, and let's also remember that it's anathema in this country, but it's very common in other parts of the world, especially in Europe, where and we know the model that the BBC has, but all over Scandinavia, there's public funding models, and there's, there are people doing very good work there. So it's not like this is something that's completely, it's not like it's a completely unheard of idea. There are people who are doing it every day and doing it well.
Mm-hmm. No, and the news outlets at the moment who are really seeing some increases in traction have been public media. So NPR and public television are actually doing pretty well right now. And I think some of that has to do not so much with the government support, but having had a different diversification of the revenue model all along, with membership and sponsorship and other. They've been able to be more stable and not as reactive, perhaps, and able to invest. So we do have models of government funded or supported real credible journalism now. So it's not completely crazy for us. So, one of the other things that I think has been interesting has been some talk about Fox News and whether or not they should be held accountable in terms of the misinformation space and what that looks like, especially in light of the virus. I wondered if either of you had thoughts on that. And that's another thing, suing the media has not been something that any of us were interested in doing, but that's starting to burble up with this crisis. That's been a new thing as well.
I'll put that over to Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not
a free expression question, right? It's like
it is. I mean, it's something. Our general view. We've done a lot of work on questions of misinformation and fake news, and the vast bulk of it is protected under the First Amendment, and we support that. We don't think the answer, by and large, lies in banning or punishing it, and we are very concerned about the thin lines that can separate, whether it's hyperbole or political hoo-ha, or just the heated rhetoric of a vociferously waged campaign from actual, fake news. And so it does concern us to embolden, empower the government to crack down and silence. And I think the danger is particularly vivid. If you imagine sort of prosecuting news agencies right now, you can imagine who would be on the receiving end of that, and it wouldn't be Fox News. Now, that being said,
well, let's by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but let's remember that the president has sued the New York Times and CNN already. So he's already gone down this road.
In his personal capacity, which I think is outrageous, and to me, intuitively, is just totally inconsistent with the First Amendment. Although a First Amendment lawyer will say that he can do that in his personal capacity because he's not, it's not an action of government, but it obviously carries the weight of the presidency for him to, seek to retaliate against whether it's a book author or a journalism organization for the content of what they've written. But, a private lawsuit, I think it's a question of whether there's any sort of cause of action. I mean, if you could prove that, this is deliberate, willful dissemination of misinformation and, medically unsound information that is contradicted by the internal guidance that was circulating within the news organization for their own employees. I don't know if that rises to the level of a cause of action. I think it does raise concerns, but I think a lot of it will hinge on, whether that standard of willful deceit and reckless endangerment can be met, and whether the evidence will substantiate that.
I
If
think
it's more in the vein of, these things are debatable and, different scientists are saying different things, which has been true throughout a lot of this pandemic, I think then, regrettable, irresponsible, but not illegal.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to have to answer to their own viewers, a lot of whom are older. It's an older audience, and they're very vulnerable, and there are going to be people who are going to suffer as a result. So I think, I mean, I'm less forgiving of them because I think, it's one thing I mean, a lot of this stuff that they were spouting wasn't debatable. It was fantasy. So I think there's going to be this could finally be the thing where they have to pay a sort of commercial price, which I think is why you're starting to see members of the Murdoch family, for instance, sort of step up and say, "Whoa, maybe this went on too far." I think they're starting to be afraid of that.
Yeah,
It's also a question of their advertisers. How can advertisers sort of stand by this? As we learn that there was different guidance being handed out internally. There were people who were aware of the facts and recognized that what was being broadcast was inaccurate. Obviously the picture is complicated by the fact that we have the misinformation purveyor in chief at the White House podium day in and day out talking about unproven scientific treatments and containment measures that haven't been implemented, that he says are working perfectly. And so, the whole kind of quality of our discourse is degraded by that, and people become inured to misinformation. So I don't have enormous confidence that the viewership of Fox News is going to, stand up in rebellion. I think we would all be better off if people did hold, both leaders and news organizations accountable for accuracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's important for us to have responsibility and culpability in some of the decisions that have been made and some of the outcomes that we've seen, both on the business side and on the news side. That's, there are different extremes of that, but we're seeing a lot of that play out now in ways that are perhaps unfixable and really disturbing.
Well, I also think it's related to the subject that we were talking about earlier, which is how do we get people to rally around the importance of local news in their community. And if they're being told by the most watched cable outlet in the country that a lot of journalism is fake and that reporters are out to hurt the country, it makes that case more difficult. Which is why the president's it's easy to dismiss the president's rhetoric as a political stump speech, but it is insidious in that it does trickle down and into local communities around the country. I mean, the New York Times can defend itself, but now we're at the point where much smaller places, some of them in parts of the country that support the president, are going to have to make the case that we need your support And his actions and Fox's actions have made that case more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, a couple points. You're absolutely right that we see, I think kind of the Trumpification of our whole society and this impulse to punish people for speaking out. Ron DeSantis excluding a reporter from a news briefing in Florida because they dared ask about social distancing, in the press room. And so we do see this kind of pattern of copycat dismissiveness and contemptuousness toward the press. That said, the surveys show that citizens consistently trust their local media more than they do the national media. And they believe that these reporters who they see within their own communities are more connected and more truthful in their coverage. And so that, is a kind of shred of hope, if we want to rebuild an information ecosystem where people, know where to turn for factual information. Local news should be a centerpiece of that. And I think in the COVID context, that's being borne out, and people are really, they are seeing that this essential information about how to sort of go about your life under this crisis is coming from these local outlets, and that they're a lifeline.
Yeah, seeing some of the stories now that people were believing that the media was overhyping early in the coverage, when that's just, we don't overhype, we just report what's happening. And so now the reality of what's happened has caught up. And I think in this case, there's so much that is coming true that we were sort of told by some outlets wasn't going to be true, some individuals and outlets. And that's been a bit of a sea change, because typically it's like a story in a place versus the story everywhere. So sort of the preponderance of that is different than what I've seen in my career previously. I think that we may see kind of it might be something of a sea change, but it might be too late, to Kyle's point, because at the same time that we've had this hit on the economy, it's been a gigantic hit on advertising. That's a huge element. So it's hurting this other business that's related to the business that we do as well. And
yeah,
we were talking a little about the business models and other things too, but.
Yeah, you're seeing a real, it's devastating, the alt weekly landscape. I mean, those outlets depended on live events for a big chunk of their advertising, and restaurants, and basically everything that you do when you're with people.
Right.
That's
music, luncheons, everything.
Yeah, that's completely now just has sort of been taken out from under them. And you also, frankly, seen a little bit of opportunistic cutting, where I think you had some outlets that were not doing so great, and were especially that are owned by sort of investment groups, or who sort of seize on the opportunity. I mean, I thought very quickly, it was like, oh, well, we're a week and a half into this, and they're saying, well, we're going to cut way back. So that was clearly in the works already. But it's just going to become, I mean, it's like everything that we're living through right now. None of us know where the other side is. I don't. I mean, I don't know where the other side. I live in New York City, and every day I sort of look for glimmers of hope in the data, and some days I see it and some days I don't. And I'm trying to sort of think about, are we going to, are my children going to be back in school, or what is the, and we don't know anything. And I think we have to get through that phase first, and then we can start like looking at the battlefield and sort of say, where do we go now?
Mm-hmm. So what does this phase look like? You've got a situation where, like you said, we don't know where it ends, how long it's going to take, what that looks like. The things that we've done in the past really haven't been working, and the things that we lean on for revenue are gone. How do you build that trust? What could that look like? Suzanne mentioned that trust is up with local. That's the latest Gallup poll. The credibility of local news operations has increased in the most recent polling. But are you seeing some green shoots of hopefulness, or silver lining in any of this?
I mean, my hope is that some of the stimulus money, whether it's local news outlets that are independent and can apply for small business administration financing, or a more structured scheme, hopefully to address this sector, that's a bridging move. That's a stopgap. That's something that we hope will prevent outlets from going out of business entirely, because once they disappear, they do not come back. And so there's a finality at stake here, just over the next couple of months during this, extraordinary period where, we may well see news outlets just closing their doors permanently. And then once we get beyond, though, that this kind of crisis phase, it really is, the hope is, as we sort of start to look at many facets of our society, like, for example, the health disparities that are leading to some of the grave gaps that we're now learning about in terms of who really is hit by this disease and how hard, in terms of different minority populations within cities. My hope is that the precariousness and essentiality of local news is, another great societal revelation that emerges from this. And we have made the case for, that local journalism is a public good, and that we need a congressional commission, in the style of the original Carnegie Commission that led to the establishment of our Public Broadcast Corporation, to re-examine the support that we give and bring that whole system up to date so that we can provide some permanent, long-term sustenance to these organizations, shoring up the role that they play in our democracy. We think it needs to be done very carefully, and that we need to be looking at models from around the world in terms of how editorial independence is preserved. There are also models in the scientific arena with research funding, in the arts sector and humanities sector, where with the very substantial funding that goes to US universities. So, we think there's a way to do this, and that, perhaps this stimulus phase can kind of destigmatize the idea of expanded public funding and catalyze a robust, in-depth debate and examination, that will take place going forward. That I would say is the hopeful scenario.
Yeah, I agree. We have a couple questions, so I thought I would hop to those. The first is from Gordon Skinner, and he asks, what about having the press and journalism as a public utility? We've touched on that sort of, and why not have it be a public benefit corporation, and not be underwritten by the government or be a privately held business? So the idea of a B Corp idea, I know, Kyle, you've written a little bit about various business models that might make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, these things get bogged down very quickly, and in tax issues and legal issues. But I mean, I think the idea is sort of right. There's already, I think there's some legislation, and Suzanne probably knows more about this, in California that enables for-profit media to create nonprofit arms so they can collect that kind of funding. I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, even the New York Times is doing that now. I think they're creating some sort of nonprofit arms to fund
foundation.
To fund foundation reporting. I mean, to allow for foundation funding. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the kind of creative approaches we got to be thinking about. I think there is a risk that a lot of what we're talking about, these are really big ideas. They're going to take quite a while to unfold at a time when everything else in American society is being rebuilt at the same time. So I do fear that some of this stuff isn't going to come soon enough. So I think, we also have to be thinking short term about what can news organizations do today. I mean, one of the things that you're starting to see a lot more of is just cooperation across outlets. So this idea that we're all kind of competitive with every other journalistic outlet in the country is, I think, is not the way to look at the moment that we're in. So you're seeing now a lot more, ProPublica has been doing this for a long time, where they cooperate with local news outlets, and NPR has been very good at kind of stitching its stations together to do reporting. But we got to be looking at the LA Times and the local newspaper in Texas and a local newspaper in Illinois and the local TV station in Florida, all working together on a story that they have common interest in and sharing and pooling resources. We at CJR we grew frustrated about a year ago with the lack of adequate coverage of the climate crisis. So we decided that we were going to try to put together a collaboration of news outlets around the world, and with the goal of everybody doing more and better climate coverage and sharing their content that they had. And we didn't know what would happen. We didn't know if people would be into it. We were trying to get competing organizations to be part of the same collaborative and share information. It's called Covering Climate Now. And now there's 400 news organizations around the world, including competing, like there's Reuters is a member, as is Bloomberg, as is AFP. They're all in the same business, but they recognize that in order to really move the needle on this stuff, they have to work together and they have to share. So I've been really encouraged by that. I mean, that seems like a million years ago that we launched that. And it seems like, people are focused on different things, although I would argue that there are a lot of crossovers between the corona story and the climate story. But it does prove that news outlets can work together and collaborate and sort of have an impact that they can magnify.
I think you're seeing, I'm a strong believer in collaboration and partnerships, and I don't think that the TV station down the street is my enemy. Like, I think, there are a lot of other bigger enemies or threats, like Facebook and Google having most of the digital advertising. There are things that are more detrimental to our operations than being able to partner with the TV station or the NPR station in El Paso, or figuring out ways to get the coverage that you need, whether they're one of your cousins in your company or not. Your example was the LA Times and others who are independents, which I think is a really good example. Someone also asked about nonprofit news and the nonprofit model. There is one newspaper is the first one out in Salt Lake, which has that nonprofit status that they had gotten agreed to. There are a couple others that are dabbling in that space. I've tended to say that is not a solution. It's part of a solution. It's not a magic bullet, because you still, even if you're a nonprofit, you still have to figure out how to fund journalism. So what is that? They're not suddenly also not taking pay. So I think that's an interesting thing. To that point, we have another question from Bruce Gaber in Bethesda, Maryland, who says, I'm fortunate enough to have been looking at ways to creatively spend my recovery money. How might we spread the idea of contributing some of this money to support local journalism? And certainly we encourage people to subscribe, and I've been subscribing like crazy, and it's not a ton of money, but what other things have you seen where that's been? And you talked about the foundational money going into to support some journalism, but other things that you all have seen, answering Mr. Gaber's question.
Yeah, I think one point that Bear is mentioning is, look, there has been this huge philanthropic infusion of $300 million over the last few years into journalism, and some amazing organizations have been brought to life with those resources, like ProPublica, that are doing extraordinary work, and they're partnering with leading media outlets here in the US and around the world, and breaking vital stories. But a comparatively very small percentage of those resources really are going to local media and this part of the market. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. It has a lot to do with how foundations work. They're trying to change it. There are new projects underway. They're trying to push those monies out to the grassroots. But as you say, it is not a panacea. First of all, even if the most robust and rosy projections of how that philanthropic investment might grow just doesn't come anywhere. You're talking 300 million and 35 billion. The numbers just don't add up. It's never going to be a way to compensate and keep alive the kind of local news infrastructure that we are accustomed to. So I think it's very important. I think, one piece that, particularly we would like to see is more connective tissue within individual communities so that local philanthropists and citizens recognize the value of local media and celebrate that value and support that value, potentially not just as subscribers, but as where nonprofit entities and arms have been set up as supporters and donors as well. And that's something in the communities where we work, creating that connective tissue. And often, while the data on trust points in the right direction and levels of trust of local media are high, there also are all kinds of disconnects and misperceptions about local media. People don't know a lot about how the news is made. They often don't know, especially younger generations, they don't know the individuals who are behind it. So a lot of the work we've been doing is sort of building up that connective tissue so people understand and recognize these local news organizations as vital institutions within their community that they engage with, that they support, the welfare of which they see as a matter of public concern.
Well, and it's also incumbent on these news organizations to humanize themselves. I mean, we did a story, and now it's been a couple of years ago, but there was a paper in Pennsylvania that was in where most of its readership base voted for Trump, and they after the election they started getting, you guys are fake news, you guys are fake news, and they decided instead of just arguing with these people, they actually sort of invited them into the newsroom and said, hey, come on in. We'll show you how we work. You can meet our editors and just get a better sense of how we operate. And what was interesting is that when they first put out this call, nobody took them up on it. So they sort of upped the ante and said, okay, we'll buy you a pizza. Like we'll pay for your lunch if you'll just come in. And ultimately people did. And they had a really interesting conversation about, like, they asked the readers, why do you think we're fake news? And they would say, well, you ran this headline that said, Trump and Clinton, and the local people were like, that was an AP story. Like, we didn't write that story. That was a wire service story. So can you point us to something that we did that feeds this belief? And so there was sort of slowly a kind of breakdown of this kind of mistrust that still existed there. So I think, it's important for sort of leaders in the community to take this on, but it's also important for the news outlets themselves. I mean, one other little story, you mentioned that I ran a sort of group of hyper-local papers in Manhattan for a little while, and we decided we wanted to do the same thing. So we like it's sort of a crazy idea, but we got an RV and we parked it on the sidewalk in Manhattan, and we basically said, this is office hours for the local newspaper, come by the RV and chat. One problem was that we didn't clear it with the cops that we were going to be doing this.
I was going to say, did you have a
we were quickly surrounded by NYPD saying, what are you doing here? But once we sort of sold them on the idea that it wasn't terrible, and people lined up, and people came and they brought stuff and gave us ideas. So I mean, I do think that it's incumbent on us to make it clear that we don't stand apart from these communities, that we're in these communities.
Yeah, and people want to feel connected, and they want to feel like they belong, and they have pride of place, and we should too, because we're serving them and reminding people that we're their neighbors and their family and friends too, and what that looks like, and that requires some vulnerability and humility too. I think that you're seeing more and more of it. I had a student introduce me to his aunt and uncle at an event not long ago, and the uncle said, I remember you actually answered my email when I emailed you a question about circulation. And I'm like, absolutely I did, but not everybody does. And it makes a difference. And he remembered that from years ago. And another question about, have you seen local publications that have successfully bridged the digital divide? You know, people talk about this being, oh, you know, if they were only digital, and that, as you know, and we know, isn't the answer, but have you seen local ones that have done a good job of that? The national players, obviously, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which was very early to the paywall game, but
I mean, there's the ones that I'm most familiar with are have a sort of different funding models. I mean, the Texas Tribune in Austin does an amazing job. That's a purely digital publication, as is The City, which is a fairly new publication in New York that covers local news really, really well. I mean, I got to say, like, the number of examples of what were traditional local, especially independent print publications that are now thriving digitally, it's a very, very small number.
You're not seeing, I mean, even the pure play digital properties are struggling and having to do layoffs, and, you know, even some of the digital darlings, because they're supported in the same way that the traditional media are by and large. And
right.
That's made it really
there's just
a struggle.
This obvious problem of scale. You know, the way that the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal can do it is that they offer a national product. And so even though the advertising rates are, you know, so much, and the subscription prices are so much drastically lower than it was back in the days of print, you know, they can make up for a lot of that on just sheer volume by offering a national product. But if you have only got sort of the universe of Seattle or Dallas or Des Moines, you know, to work with in terms of who would be interested in the news that you're producing, you know, those numbers just don't add up. And we have seen, you know, Seattle Times and others, you know, innovating, Dallas Morning News, you know, and doing creative things and having some success and traction, you know, with particular strategies and approaches and offerings. And I think, you know, there are other ideas afoot about trying to make local marketplaces and, you know, access to the kinds of very localized vendors, whether it's for weddings or funerals, you know, easy to reach through local papers, building on, you know, some of the services that, you know, outlets like the Wedding Channel provide, but making it happen at a very local level. You know, it hasn't fully manifested, and whether it can and it will, you know, remains a big uncertainty. Nobody has cracked this. If they had, I think we would see that model replicated all over the country.
Mm-hmm. I've seen some really interesting stuff out of the San Francisco Chronicle, just sharing, where they focused very intensely on conversion, on what kinds of stories convert people to paid subscribers, focusing particularly on those digital subscribers, and that using that data to really help that you know, understanding of what it is that people are looking for and what makes them loyal to the experience, I think is really thoughtful and smart, using the research, the data that you have, and the behaviors of people to help make determinations about how to build that connectivity. That question was from Michael Elling, and I have one more from Jim Loving asking, from a public policy perspective, has this challenge made it to the radar of the US Congress or any state houses? So what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this earlier that, you know, there's just this letter that was put out today by about a dozen Democratic senators talking about the importance of channeling stimulus monies to local news. And that's getting a fair amount of coverage today. And so, yes, there are folks in Congress who have become seized with this issue of late, you know, I'd say, and COVID is helping with that, because they, you know, both because they recognize the value that local news is providing, and also because of the intensification of the pressures on local news and the kind of manifest shedding of jobs that we are witnessing. And yeah, we have seen some signs of life at the state level. I mean, New Jersey, Kyle touched on, and it's, it's sort of a bit of a sob story. It began as a huge initiative to channel some spectrum licensing revenues that had come to the state toward local news, and it was going to be over $100 million. And just over time, this very ambitious kind of visionary proposal for how to shore up local news got whittled down and whittled down. I think now there's maybe $1 or $2 million left that potentially will be used for that purpose. And so I think that's one of the hard things here. As the essentiality is obvious to us, and it seems particularly evident, at a moment of national crisis and a health crisis that impacts localities very differently. But we're not used to paying for this. We're not used to prioritizing it. It's sort of not on the list alongside, education, healthcare, and sort of the voting issues and the pocketbook issues that people center in how they think about our politics, how politicians think about budgets. So it's an uphill battle to sort of notch a position that local news is a public good, and that we actually need to take money away from other public benefits and services in order to underwrite this. That's a tall order. I agree with Kyle. It may be a long time before we make significant headway. I do think it's a debate we have to have, because there is no other solution, and we should capitalize on the momentum we have now, where there's suddenly some more interest and recognition of this problem.
Right. We just have a couple minutes left, and we've covered a lot of ground here. Perhaps, what glimmers of hope are you seeing, or what silver lining in this? As we've talked a lot about the focus on, or that COVID is putting a focus on this and how important it is. Kyle, you've been looking for that. What could you?
Yeah, I don't have as much hope right now on the model front. My area of hope lies in journalists' sort of individual commitments to sort of tell these stories. I mean, I can't tell you how many pitches we've gotten from people who said, I was laid off yesterday and I want to do this story today. I mean, there's, people are, I expect that we're going to see what we saw after the 2016 election, where after the 2016 election, you saw a surge of people applying to go into journalism, college journalism programs, just because they felt a calling. And I have a feeling we're going to see the same thing now. So that is great, and it's heartwarming. But we just have to find a way to pay these people salaries.
We have seen a Trump bump in admission to journalism schools, and Cronkite has its largest class ever, that came in this past fall. We, a sort of fun and heartwarming thing, one of my colleagues posted yesterday on Twitter asking journalists something that they love about their job. And I was really loving reading that thread, because like you said, there's still so much heart for the work and dedication to the mission under some really, really difficult situations, whether it's not just pay cuts, you're reporting from home, the economy's going crazy, and there are a lot of things that are making that harder to do the work. And there's a lot of pressure in that. And they're also out on the front lines reporting and putting themselves in harm's way. So I would agree with you on that. Suzanne, any last thoughts as we're wrapping up? And
yeah, I guess, a hopeful thought is that the public also becomes sensitized during this crisis to the essential role of journalism. I think it is a moment where the idea of holding our public officials accountable, I mean, the way this has gone down in this country, both at the national level and local level, and delays and mistakes that were made that have cost lives and affected families and communities in such a profound way, that there's a sense that, unearthing, digging up these stories, holding these officials accountable allowing people to know why it is that, their family member, lost their life because a lockdown wasn't called earlier enough, or they were not aware of a piece of the risk. So I have some hope that people's interest and belief in journalism will be stoked by this crisis, and that, that too will help fuel and find a solution.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank both of you, Suzanne and Kyle, and everyone who tuned in today, which means you actually care about something that's really vitally important to all of us, but certainly to the three of us. The Free Speech Project, as I said, is a year-long inquiry with FutureTense, which is a project of ASU, New America, and Slate Magazine in collaboration with American University's Tech, Law, and Security program. We'll be holding additional events like this, and we really appreciate all of you and your interest and your continuing support of a free press, free expression, and democracy in America. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.